Hi there, this is S.J. Thomason with Christian-Apologist.com. And today we're going to talk about objective morality and whether or not we have objective morality. So stay tuned. I'm going to ask you a list of questions, and then what we're going to do is we're going to go to a Q&A. So I really appreciate everyone coming by. This time I'm actually watching from a different screen so I can see your questions on another screen. So let me just actually get that adjusted. I apologize for the delay here, but let me look at some questions and I want you to answer for me whether you think these pictures that you see and what you see in the pictures are objectively and morally wrong. So right now I have a picture of Anne Frank, and many of you might know who she is. You might have read the diary of Anne Frank from World War II. She and her family were captured by the Nazis, and unfortunately she did not return from the death chambers where they burned Jewish people. Is this atrocity? And you can see pictured here some other people who'd been captured by Nazis. Again, Anne Frank was just a young woman, young child, completely innocent. Is this objectively wrong? Would you judge that as objectively wrong? And what does objectively wrong mean? It means it's wrong regardless of what anyone's opinion is. So this is an objective calamity on society. So I want to say hi, Jim Majors. Okay, so I want to ask you another question. Look at this next one. Is this objectively wrong? Now, this is Camp 14 in North Korea. This is a survivor of Camp 14. If you have read anything on Camp 14 or any of the other camps in North Korea, what you would have learned is that people were imprisoned merely because they disagreed with the government. And a lot of cases, if one person in a family disagreed with the government, the entire family would be imprisoned. This gentleman was born into Camp 14, and the sorts of torture that he endured while there is something that's completely unspeakable. For example, at one point they hung him when he was just a child by a hook. Okay, so that's the kind of thing that they did in North Korea, which is morally and objectively wrong, I would say. So do you agree with me? Drowning babies is morally and objectively wrong. We're not even sure if babies were present back then, but we don't know. Let's go back. All right, so here is I had a really awful dream last night. It was the weirdest dream. I dreamt that someone I knew was near a pond, and the pond was full of alligators, and where I live there are lots of alligators. And in my dream, this person carried a baby into the pond and let the baby go, and suddenly I saw blood everywhere. It was a horrific dream. Now, would giving a baby to a pond full of hungry alligators be objectively and morally wrong? I would say so. Now we'll get to the next one. Is it objectively and morally right for a mother to love and care for her infant? I think it's fair to say that this is objectively and morally right. Is it morally and objectively right for people to rescue others in Houston when they had that horrible hurricane a couple of years back? Was it objectively and morally right or correct action to rescue people? So that's what we're doing. Was it morally and objectively right to rescue people in the Chilean coal mine in 2010? I think that of all these, you can answer if something is morally and objectively right or wrong. We have objective morality. Again, this is morality that stands stands independent of a person's opinion. So to understand this, we're going to talk a little bit about metaethics. So you ask yourself, what is metaethics? Metaethics is the idea that it's a branch of analytical philosophy that explores the status, foundations, and scope of moral values, properties, and words, whereas the fields of applied ethics and normative theory focus on what is moral. Metaethics focuses on what morality itself is. Just as two people may disagree about the ethics of, for example, physician-assisted suicide, while nonetheless agreeing that at the more abstract level of a general normative theory, such as utilitarianism, so too many people who disagree at the level of a general normative theory nonetheless agree about this fundamental existence and status of morality itself, or vice versa. In this way, metaethics may be thought of as a highly abstract way of thinking philosophically about morality. For this reason, metaethics is also occasionally referred to as second order moral theorizing to distinguish it from first order level of normative theory. Now, what that means, if you do statistics, and let me explain this, if you have a number of factors in a statistical equation, and say the factors are all related to each other. So you might have one version of ethics, a second version of ethics, third version of ethics. They're all related to each other. So they're on the first order. So then you take it to a higher level, or as you want to look at an umbrella view of this, you take it at the higher level and you collapse these things into one grand theory. That would be something that they would call a second level. So for example, if I'm looking at the 5-factor model of personality, there are 5 factors or personality domains. In the personality domain of conscientiousness, there are things such as order and hardworking, achievement striving. Those sorts of things are in that. So when you collapse those to the second order of conscientiousness, it takes into account the various facets of conscientiousness. So hopefully that makes sense for you. And I want to say thank you for people who are here. I'm looking here, I see drivers and cyclists, civil discourse, Jesse Camping, Frank Christian, Jim Majors, and Stephen Steen. So all some of my favorite people here. So that's great. Thank you so much. The reason I'm doing this, actually, in talking about moral ontologies, which is where I'm going to go, but the reason I'm talking about this kind of stuff is because I was supposed to do a debate with Skylar Fiction on Saturday or Sunday, and that didn't pan out because of his sense of humor, and my sense of humor, apparently they do not align with each other. And so anyway, so I'm not having a debate with him. So I had made some of these slides to explain why some of the things that he was going to discuss were category errors. And so let me further explain that in this. So moral ontology refers to whether moral values and duties objectively exist independently of people and are to be discovered by people. Ontology is defined as a branch of metaphysics that covers the nature of being, and moral ontology suggests that we have a standard of good and bad values or right and wrong duties. Moral ontology answers the question of whether objective and moral values and duties exist. So moral epistemology refers to the knowledge of morality and how one comes to know morals and what's right and wrong. If one states that different cultures have different moral values and duties, one is applying moral epistemology. These are epistemological questions of how one comes to know moral values and duties. These are not to be conflated with whether moral values and duties exist. And that was the question that Skylar and I were going to address. Do objective moral values and duties exist? Or even just looking at that a little higher level, does objective morality itself exist? Some cultures may be closer to being right in their understanding of morality than others, yet this does not mean objective rights or wrongs do not exist. It is a non sequitur to state that because different cultures have different perspectives of right and wrong, that objective standards of right and wrong do not exist. So then there's the emic versus etic distinction. So moral ontology is an etic, which means that when you quantify it, when you analyze it methodologically, you would do a more quantitative or objective means of methods. And this is, again, an etic view of morality, whereas moral epistemology is an emic, or more qualitative and a contextual view. Compare this with a fishbowl analogy. If one is applying an etic view, one would analyze the fishbowl of a culture from an objective position outside of it. If one is applying an emic view, one would analyze the fishbowl from within the fishbowl. Moral ontology dictates one's epistemological beliefs. In other words, what people believe about reality will influence the relationship one thinks one should have to reality. So there are 2 types of ontological positions in metaethics. There's moral realism and moral relativism. Moral realists believe that one truth exists and truth is unchanging and is discoverable via objective measurements. This is a deductive approach from general to specific, which suggests that one can start from a generalization to make specific hypotheses about reality. Moral relativists believe that truth does not exist without meaning. So truth is dependent upon the meaning you attach to it. Reality is created and evolves and changes depending on one's context and situations. This is an inductive approach from specific to general, which suggests that one analyzes the specifics of various situations and transfers those to other similar contexts. So what is objective morality? Moral realists believe in objective morality, moral values and duties that are stance independent. They do not vary as a function of the opinions of any person, culture, or area. They are standards against which we judge practices, and values include the intrinsic and axiomatic values of life: liberty, justice, truth, equality, and equity. This is why when you looked at the pictures at the outset, you fundamentally and intrinsically realize that these were violations of people's lives, liberty, justice, truth, equality, and equity in many cases. So these values are self-evident as indicated in the UN Declaration of Human Rights and the US Declaration of Independence. Values are what's good and bad, and duties are what's right and wrong. And those include the golden rule, which we know we ought to follow. Let me look and see if there are any questions at this point. And Jim wants to debate this topic. Yes, I'm very interested in doing that. So let's see what else we have. Stephen Steen says he goes by the Trump standard of morals. If you have a tweet condemning something, you are free to do it without concern. I have to admit, the president of the United States is a little bit tweet happy. I'm tweet happy too, but I can get away with it. I'm not the president of the United States. So it's very funny. Oh, and Trump is, you guys are very funny in the audience. Trump is golfing and no tweeting at the moment. Guys are hilarious. So what is moral relativism? It is a view that moral values and duties vary as a function of one's culture, era, or subjective opinion. So an example is when in Rome, do as the Romans. Bribery is acceptable in this country, or female genital mutilation is acceptable in Y country, or breaking in 10-year-olds with sex is acceptable in the British Pitcairn Islands. Now that is actually true. What they do is older males break in females at ages as early as 10. If you can say that's objectively wrong, then you and I are on the same page. So we do have some level of both moral relativism and moral realism. I can say that there are some objective and relative values. So for example, we're starting off as individuals, and you can look at these influencers on our lives. So you can see right here that at the earliest levels, what's determined is our race, ethnicity, gender identity, gender, sexual orientation, mental ability, physical ability, and then age as we get older. And then as we get older, we have these experiences, and our environment shape us in a lot of different ways. And you can notice some of the different aspects of our lives which influence our morality. And so that could include life experience, family status, religion, language, work experience, etc. And then you get to even a higher level, and you might say, well, now we've got other factors that play into things that distinguish diversity and distinguish our moral foundation. And these could relate to things like seniority in your organization, management status, department, group, those kind of things, job titles. So these are also influencers. So these are all influencers of some of the decisions that we make and also of our moral foundations. So what we're going to do right now is we're going to look at individual level questions of moral epistemology, because at the individual level, this is what is addressed, epistemology. So here we go. We've got variations between people in genetics and personality. So going back to Charles Darwin, he said, so in regard to mental qualities, their transmission is manifest in our dogs, horses, and other domestic animals. Besides special tastes and habits, general intelligence, courage, bad and good temper, etc., are certainly transmitted. With man, we now know through the admirable labors of Mr. Galton, that genius, which implies a wonderfully complex combination of high faculties, tends to be inherited. And on the other hand, it is too certain that insanity and deteriorated mental powers likewise run in the same family. So the idea is we're understanding how we come to have these biological traits, and this is an epistemology. So a lot of people point to the social development of morality to try to ground our morality in this source. But again, this is looking instead at epistemology. It doesn't explain the existence. So it's a category error to use this approach. But let me just explain this a little bit further. So since Darwin's time, we have been able to dial down on some of the causes of the variability in human populations due to studies on phenotypes, which are observable characteristics influenced by our environments, and genotypes, which is our genetic code. Evolutionary biologists and psychologists often make cases that our moral behaviors can be explained as a function of humanity's adaptations to their environments over time. In other words, they make a descriptive case for morality, which is an attempt to describe as-is conditions and practices and behaviors. The descriptive arguments in favor of moral evolution tend to focus on the idea that cultures adapted to their environments over time, both competing for resources and cooperating within in-groups to enhance their chances of survival. Illes, Arvey, and Bouchard noted that traits, work attitudes, values, and interests and behaviors are heritable, More specifically, the authors reported that the heritability of intelligence is between 0.6 and 0.8. And of course, you square these numbers to get the variation coefficient. The heritability of five-factor model of personality is 0.41 for emotional stability, 0.49 for extroversion, 0.45 for openness to experience, 0.35 for agreeableness, and 0.38 for conscientiousness. And so empathy is a facet of agreeableness. The heritability of positive and negative emotionality is between 0.43 and 0.47. And the heritability of a person's attitude toward being the leader of a group is 0.41. For all these traits, the genetic component is less than half after it's squared. Non-genetic components, such as the environment in which a person is raised, are in each case more important in determining how people behave. These findings, according to Cy Gart, offer strong evidence against an evolutionary hypothesis for morality. When biologists and psychologists have described descriptively our as-is genetic predispositions and environmental influences on certain behaviors, they cannot explain our should-be moral oughts and duties. It is a category error for them to define our moral prescriptions using a tool that is descriptive. An explanation of our objective moral values and duties rests in the wheelhouse of philosophers. So I'm going to check for more questions at this point. Oh, we've got some interesting stuff going on in the chat. I don't see a question, so I'm going to go right back here. So now let's look at the cultural, societal level questions of moral ontology. Again, how whether or not we have objective moral values and duties, whether that exists. So at the cultural level, there are a number of different studies, and I've got some references down at the bottom of the slide here from Kluckhohn and Strodebeck, Gert Hofstede, Hall, Trump and Schwartz, the Globe study. There are other studies that reference this kind of stuff, but all of these global studies that have looked at different cultures around the world have grouped them in very similar ways to what you see this grouping is here. So people realize that you're likely within a culture to be more related to people within your culture than in other cultures outside of your culture. And that relates to things like how power and authority are distributed in society. In the United States, we tend to be kind of in the middle on power distance and this idea of egalitarianism versus hierarchy. Social relationships, so it's looking at whether a society is more individualistic or collectivist. So if you look in the United States, you're going to find that we're the highest in individualism in all societies of the world, according to numerous studies. And other societies, such as in South America, Asia, many parts of Asia, and Northern Europe tend to be very collective. And that can also be distinguished by whether or not it's in-group collectivism. So for example, in China, you're very collective towards people in your own in-group. Versus Northern Europe, they're looking at what they call institutional collectivism. So these tend to be countries that are highly institutionally collective. Those tend to be the countries that have lots of social safety welfare nets. And you will find that in places such as Sweden, Norway, Denmark, and other countries like that. Another way to distinguish cultures is that looking at uncertainty and social control. So it's this idea of what they call uncertainty avoidance. So in Germany, they have very high levels of uncertainty avoidance, meaning they don't have much of a tolerance for ambiguity. They don't tend to like change. It's very related to the facet of conservatism and as opposed to liberalism. And this particular view in Germany, for example, this leads to the fact that they like lots of rules and regulations, and they like to have a lot of structure, and they have a civil law code. And one of the reasons, again, is they're trying to avoid uncertainty, so they want everything spelled out. Another variation between cultures is relating to the environment. So in our country, in the United States, we have this mastery idea where we want to master our environment as much as possible. Other places, such as in China, they talk about feng shui, and this is this idea of being in harmony with your environment. And then another dimension is looking at time and work. So in the United States, time is of the essence. You're wasting my time. This is too much time. You have to show up to professional meetings on time. If you're in the workplace and you don't show up on time, it's basically you're scolded in a way. It's a very negative thing that you do. If you show up to a job interview late, you better have a really good excuse for showing up late in the United States, because people in the United States do not like the idea of others wasting their time. Social events are a little bit different. There's some leeway as far as when you show up to social events in the United States, but in other countries, time is much less it's not much of a commodity, it's more relative. People in other cultures might they might show up late to work and say, well, I was on the phone with my mother, and clearly family is more important to me than the workplace. And so that would be expected and a pretty good reason for someone to be late, for example, in a place such as Mexico, where time is not commoditized as it is here. So now let's look at global levels of moral ontology. So I'm going to list a few studies that have identified some universals across the globe. So I just talked about at the cultural level, we see distinctions between cultures and we see a lot of differences between cultures. However, if we go to the higher level, at the global level, we're going to notice that when people do surveys of people all around the world, they find that we have these commonalities. And this is something that's not as expressed in universities. It's kind of sad because people love to focus on relativism and they love to focus on our differences and diversity and that kind of stuff. And a lot of times they don't focus on our similarities. So for example, Kinnear found that we have a commitment to something greater than oneself. There's self-respect, but with humility, self-discipline, and acceptance of personal responsibility. People appreciate respect and caring for others, and that's the golden rule. And you'll find that in every major world religion, atheism, humanism, and the United Nations. And people tend to care for other living things and the environment. Other studies have found similarly, like for example, Dalsgaard and company found 6 recurrent values in a survey of 8 religious traditions: courage, temperance, justice, transcendence, humanity, and wisdom. And in a survey using psychological, historical, juridical, theological, and ethnographical research, Westmark identified universals in the approval of honesty, charity, mutual aid, and generosity, along with the prohibition of theft and homicide. Henrik and colleagues examined 15 societies, finding that fairness and trust were exhibited in all. So do atheists believe we have global universals, and are they subject to change? So I've got a couple of issues going on here. Jonathan Haidt has done a lot of work on what he calls moral foundations theory. And he surveyed evolutionary theories about human and primate sociality, along with lists of virtues and taxonomies of morality from psychology and anthropology to moral concerns or virtues that were shared widely across cultures. And from this, they found 5 foundations of morality. Now, Jonathan Haidt is an atheist, and a lot of atheists, like I've got someone I know on Twitter called Adam Friended, and there are also people like Sam Harris. They also believe that we have objective moral values. And so they looked at these 5 foundations, and they said that everyone tends to focus especially on care and harm and fairness, reciprocity, but also these other factors also tend to be foundations of morality across cultures. And these are in-group loyalty, authority, and purity, sanctity. And then they later added liberty and oppression. And these are, again, universal, meaning you'll find them in all cultures, but they're also stance independent, meaning these values stand regardless of what your opinions are on these values. So this idea of reverence towards care is something that everyone feels. In fact, Shalom Schwartz did find that benevolence, number 1, universalism, number 2. Benevolence at this level is saying that everyone cares for the in-group. Universalism is the idea that you're also caring for the out-group, the globe, the environment, that kind of thing. So in summary, the question of whether objective morality exists rests in moral ontology, not moral epistemology. We're products of our genes, environments, families, cultures, and religions, and variations can be found between people and societies. However, universals can also be identified, and they support axiomatic truths of life, liberty, equity, equality, justice, and truth. Without such universals and objective moral values and duties, we cannot condemn the most egregious practices in societies. We have no standard against which to make these judgments, which is why they've been codified by governing entities. As societies develop and evolve, we come to know morality, moral epistemology, but this does not mean such axioms did not exist in the first place, which is looking at moral ontology. So I hope you get those distinctions. Also, whether objective morality exists is a meta-ethical question of moral ontology. So using epistemological evidence of how we develop socially, or whether the society is acting in a morally responsible way, is a category error. Whether we have universal and objective moral values as is, or practices, is a descriptive question. Whether we have universal and objective moral duties, or looking at our moral oughts to do what's right, is a prescriptive question, which cannot be answered using descriptive means. Some of the descriptive means, I should say. And since we have universals, does that make them objective? No. If the world were corrupted and all people valued evil, this would not diminish our objective moral values and duties to do what's right. The objective moral values and duties are still there, regardless of the way people respect them. Objective morality means we have morals that are stance independent, while universal morals mean we can identify values and duties across all cultures. The presence of universal moral values and duties to do what's right suggests we have a universal source or moral lawgiver who transcends generations, cultures, and eras, who desires we do what's right. He's given us a conscience, which helps us to determine right from wrong. So C.S. Lewis said it really well. He said, you find out more about God from the moral law than from the universe in general, just as you find out more about a man by listening to his conversation than by looking at a house he has built. Now, from this second bit of evidence, we conclude that the being behind the universe is intensely interested in right conduct, in fair play, unselfishness, courage, good faith, honesty, and truthfulness. In that sense, we should agree with the account given by Christianity and some other religions, that God is good. But do not let us go too fast here. The moral law does not give us any grounds for thinking that God is good in the sense of being indulgent or soft or sympathetic. There is nothing indulgent about the moral law. It is hard as nails. It tells you to do the straight thing, and it does not seem to care how painful or dangerous or difficult it is to do. If God is like the moral law, then he is not soft. So here's my summary of the what we covered today. So I talked about some inputs. For example, the heritability of social traits. So we look at that again at the individual level, and that relates to whether or not we inherit traits. I talked about some percentages on that, and we see the outcomes of that. So if you inherited empathy, for example, an outcome, we have a probability of probably kind behavior and actions towards others. Does it change? Yes, it can change. Your heritability, you inherit certain traits, but the heritability of social traits is subject to change, and it's influenced by your environment in some ways. So there are genetic influences and also the environmental influences of phenotypes. Then the social development, and that's the development of humanity over time, that's also an as-is sort of practice notion. This also speaks to things like the probability of your behaviors, actions, norms, and practices. And what's the influence? There's the adaptation to change. Going to moral relativism and ontology is this idea that values as is, their cultural duties, obligations, and moral oughts to do what's right, and the probability of positive behaviors, norms, practices, and beliefs, that's an influencer over. So for example, if I'm in the United States, there's a higher probability that I'm going to exhibit individualist behaviors, and that can change. You also can shift your values a little bit over time. And then there's the last one of moral realism and this idea of objective morality. And again, that looks at values as is, their stance independent, and moral duties to do what's right. We're looking at both the descriptive, we've got values, and then the prescriptive, which is the duties. And then this relates again to the probability of your actions. And this particular factor is the one that says that there must be a standard that transcends cultures and eras. Okay, so that is this deal with that. So on that note, do I have questions? So I'm going to go to the, I'm going to go back to you guys. Hold on one sec. I'm going to come right back here and see if we have any questions. All right, so Happy New Year, Hellbound Heathen, and drivers, cyclists, civil discourse. So if we agreed that morality was objective, how do you prove it comes from your Christian God? That's a good question. So how do we prove it comes from the Christian God? Well, here's the thing. So we need to know what the Christian God's characteristics are. So we would say that the Christian God has these characteristics of benevolence. And if we see that the moral values and duties to do what's right also correspond with these particular traits that we assign to God, that we believe God has, then it seems pretty likely it's the Christian God, because the Christian God is intentional, personal, transcendent, and immanent. And so that's how he differs from other gods. He's not a pantheistic God and who stays off, is immanent within the environment, but might not interact with people in the environment. Is not a passive God. This moral law would suggest we have an active influencer who cares about what we do. And it also, in that same suggestion, it would also say that that wouldn't speak to the Muslim God, because Allah is known to be transcendent and not interacting with environment. So that's how we differ a little bit. And so Stephen Steen, I see him here. Happy New Year, Frank Christian. Happy New Year, Hellbound Heathen. I think we saw that. Barry Gotcha agreed. I'm reading stuff, I'm not seeing the whole thing. putting you on the spot. Does the Bible support some subjective standards as well? Hope you say yes. Are there subjective standards? Well, yeah, I think that if you go back to the Old Testament culture, there's a reason why people in those cultures were subject to Mosaic law. And so Mosaic law was a lot different than the New Covenant. And so if I went back to that culture, some of the things that they did in those cultures to us seem very foreign, and to others might not seem so foreign. So I'm just trying to open something up here. Hold on one second. It might not seem so foreign. So they were given specific laws that they had to live by, and we are given specific laws that we must live by. So for example, you look at this idea of divorce, and Jesus mentioned divorce. And so divorce in the Old Testament, Jesus said, well, your hearts were hardened. So Moses said that you could divorce your wives or husbands. But then in the New Testament, he added to that a little bit. He said, well, he would call it adultery if you divorce your wives or husbands for other reasons aside from sexual immorality. And so, meaning that if your husband or somebody else, the spouse, commits sexual immorality, you are permitted to divorce him or her. So that was how Jesus made that a little bit different. And then there were some other laws that were a little bit different too. So if you go to Acts 10, you're going to note that suddenly a lot of those foods that were prohibited in the Old Testament were allowed in the New Testament. So we have this idea of not being able to eat lobster and pig and that kind of stuff. That changed under the New Covenant. So one of the things is when we have these objective moral values and duties, we have to go with standards that are not subject to our individual points of view. So we'll say that. So let me think, is stoning adulterers and homosexuals objectively wrong? So if we look at the means of punishment in the Old Testament, the means of punishment that they used was stoning. That was something that we even saw in the New Testament. We still see in some cultures today. I can say that it depends on how you would, let me think of how to appropriately answer this. That's actually a tough question, Jim Majors. So currently in our present societies, yes, stoning adulterers and homosexuals is objectively wrong. In fact, homosexuals are given equal status in our laws and rights in the United States and in other Western cultures. In many places, they're allowed to marry. Things have changed a bit for cultures over time. Even going back to the Old Testament and looking at slavery, I'm trying to open up, some of these questions aren't showing and I'm having to hit show. Okay, so even going back to the Old Testament on slavery, there were some issues in the Old Testament that are no longer the same thing today. And so some of the punishments that they had for what they considered crimes in the Old Testament are not the same punishments that we have for these issues today. And so I can say that the punishments that are applied during Mosaic law are different than the punishment applied during the New Covenant. And so it was not said in the New Testament to go ahead and stone people for adultery or for, in fact, Jesus even said to a woman who was about to be stoned for adultery, let he who is without sin cast the first stone. And so we have an issue like that. So let me see what else we have here. If you presuppose your God exists, you could make up anything he has done. We could say that God created rape by the same token and reasoning. Well, in the Bible, it makes explicit that rape is outlawed. And so that's something that's going on. No, the objective moral standards do not change. So let me go back to explain how this works. So you have objective moral standards, and I mentioned the objective moral standards that are really important here of life, liberty, justice, equity, equality. We have these objective moral standards. Now, the standard of appreciating life, for example, in the standard of revering life and saying that you can't just go out there and kill people is something that applies across all cultures. And so we have these standards that apply across all cultures. So, and we appreciate these. And over time, we have socially evolved in such a way to be able to come closer to these appreciations of the standards which stand. So the standards don't change. People's practices and the way that they treat each other and their views of those standards might change. And so this is looking at an epistemological view of saying that, yes, it's looking at how people have come to develop something. And that's not what I'm trying to say here. I'm saying, do the standards exist? And I'm looking at moral ontology with that distinction. So one objective moral standard is this life. Okay, Brian Stevens, so one objective moral standard is life. And so it's the idea that we value life and we appreciate life. And this speaks to the abortion debate, actually. So if you take our objective moral standard of life, it would say that a baby that's formed in the womb should not be aborted. Okay, so there are certain circumstances people will try to justify it. And a lot of people, and I'm not talking about people who get abortions for the reasons that they were, it was incest or rape or anything like that. I'm talking about people who opt in for abortions. A lot of times people choose to abort babies because the babies are inconvenient or they would cost them too much money to raise. And we've had millions of babies aborted since Roe v. Wade here in the United States. So it's a pretty big issue here in the United States. And why I'm pointing that out is because when I say we value life, a lot of times when people want to treat other people in ways that devalue their lives, for example, with aborting babies, they would say, well, just this baby, I know it's 20 weeks, but it's just soft tissue, or it's just a clump of cells. So what people do is they try to dehumanize little humans so that they can justify to themselves, because they have a conscience, what's morally right or morally wrong. Okay, so that also speaks to the Nazi atrocities. So the Nazis actually pretended, they had a lot of propaganda out there to say that Jewish people were rats. And to say that Jewish people are rats was dehumanizing Jewish people. So unfortunately, millions of Jewish people were horrifically treated during the Nazi war. And that's a great example of an issue that we would have. So the idea of objective morality is we have this standard of life. So people know this, it's intrinsic to you, it's axiomatic, it's in our conscience to treat people right. And the only way that people justify not doing something right, if they're sane, I should say, because there could be insane cases, but if people justify not doing something right, a lot of times they try to break the cognitive dissonance by claiming that the person they're mistreating is less than them. So this can go back to slavery. It can go back to a lot of different things. So Brian says there's nothing we objectively ought to do. Well, actually, according to a number of different studies, we objectively ought to follow the golden rule, which is to treat others as you expect to be treated. And so that's something that they found across cultures. They found it in various religions. They found it in atheism and humanism. So it's something that's a value that transcends cultural values and opinions. I mean, transcends cultures, eras, and opinions. So I will see if there is another question. If you have a disqualification because of rape or incest, is that not devaluing the life of the fetus? I think what it is in cases of rape or incest, I like to speak to what the vast majority of these abortion cases are. So 99% of abortion cases are based on things other than rape or incest. So they've done studies under the Guttmacher Institute, and they've talked about the percentage of people who were raped or had incest, incestual rape, and the percentage is 1%. So when you have 1%, I'm speaking to the 99% of people. I don't want to make a decision for the 1%. I wouldn't tell a girl who is raped by her father that she has to carry the baby to term. And that's my personal opinion. However, if I went with an objective standard, it would actually be wrong to abort that baby too. So objectively, I would say that it is wrong to abort all babies. That's the objective standard to life. But subjectively, with the 1%, I say that there are certain conditions in that particular case. Okay, so in the slides, I also made it pretty clear there's some relativism and some universalism and some objective stuff that's out there. So you have to take a look at a lot of different issues. So don't treat others as you would like to be treated. The way they like to be treated should be more important within reason. So I'm not sure what Brian's saying, that you should treat people how they want to be treated. I think that's fair within reason, sure. So Bob's opinions, the golden rule is the core to all religions, according to Karen Armstrong. I don't know who Karen Armstrong is. She easy to say, allow abortion for rape and consent. Well, I'm just saying, or rape and incest. I am saying, I just again want to make clear, the objective moral standard to life would say that we shouldn't allow abortion in any, in any case. Sometimes there's a little bit of a relative application in some cases. And I'll say, just even going to this idea of divorce from Jesus, he said, well, we shouldn't want divorce in any cases. However, sometimes there could be something such as sexual immorality. And so in that case, but the standard is not to divorce because it's treating somebody unfairly. So No, I'm not rendering, okay, Mouse Forever is in here too. And I'm not rendering objective morality subjective. What I'm trying to tell you, I'm sure not what this isn't, I'm saying, okay, again, let's go back. We have objective values of life, liberty, justice, equity, truth, those kind of things. Now, the value of life would say that you would not, that a person should not abort. Personally, in my particular situation, I say that there's a 1% of people who abort out of rape or incest. And in my opinion, and this is my opinion, I would be more flexible in those particular cases if the person really did not want to carry the baby to term. However, I'm telling you that the standard is, my opinion does not align with the standard in that particular case. The standard is to life, and that means to value these babies. So yes, my opinion doesn't mean I'm making an exception for this objective moral code. It's saying that, it's not saying that my opinion changes the objective moral code. It's saying that that's my opinion, and there's the objective moral code out there. So sometimes my opinions don't align all the way with the objective moral code. So, okay, those are legal renderings not enforceable in any society, country, or okay, so yeah, so the laws in countries vary on abortion around the world. So we have found that kind of thing. And we're noticing that the laws are becoming more flexible towards abortion. The big issue with abortion that I would say is the fact that a lot of people believe that it's, they think it's something that makes them free. And I've seen cases where women are celebrating abortions. And that's the kind of thing that I think is morally reprehensible. Okay, so I'm not talking about the little girl who's 10 years old who was raped by her uncle, and she's definitely probably going to die if she carries the baby to term because she's so young. I'm not talking about that kind of thing. I'm talking about the cases where we have people who are celebrating abortion. So if I looked at the particular case of abortion, that's sort of what I would say with that. Any more questions? So people are just disagreeing with me or disagreeing with each other. So if I want to go back and try to explain a little bit again about what I said. So in summary, okay, we have moral, we're looking at our moral ontology. So we're looking at whether or not objective moral values and duties exist. Okay, so that is the big question that we're focusing on. That does not speak to our moral epistemology or how we came up with those objective moral values and duties. So when you look at this idea of social development and that sort of thing, that does not address the question. It's a category error. So what you want to focus on instead is looking at our moral ontology. Okay, so we're looking at, does it exist? And we can say through studies of the globe that at the universal level, we have these objective moral values and duties. We have the values that I named before, life, liberty, justice, and we have duties to follow the golden rule, for example, to seek meaning and purpose and to treat people well and to treat the environment well. So we have these moral values and duties that are out there. Now, the question is, are they stance independent? Would these duties still stand if people in the United States, for example, didn't have an opinion of them? Well, sure, that stance would still stand. Will these values still stand 2,000 years from now? Well, certainly. The idea of valuing life is still going to stand regardless of today's opinions on them. Will the value of liberty stand 2,000 years from now or 2,000 years ago? Yes, the value is there. Now, whether people follow that, that's an entirely different issue. That's speaking to epistemology. So it's not a good question to ask whether people follow it. So when people say, well, how did they treat people in the Old Testament, or how did people treat people over there in the Nazi times? Well, that's not the question of whether or not these values exist. So my big point today was to talk about whether we have the objective moral values and duties. And I would answer that, yes, we do have objective moral values and duties. They exist. They've been identified in academic studies. And these, again, are stance independent of what you think about them or how people develop them. So do we have a single objective moral concept? Yeah, the idea of valuing life. So if you look at the United Nations and you look at, again, the declarations that are out there, we talk about all humans are made in God's image, for one, but all humans are equal. Okay, all humans are should be treated equally, should be treated fairly. We've got a value to life. You're not allowed to just go out there and kill your neighbor because you don't agree with the neighbor. That's not something that's appropriate any place in the world. Now, if there's a place that suddenly becomes appropriate, that's speaking to an epistemology, and it's saying that that particular place, they're not following the moral code that's out there, but we know that there's a moral code that says you should value life. And again, we see these codified by our governments. So any more questions? Do unto others. So you determine objective values exist by the number of people who agree with them. No, that's not what I say. So I'm pointing out two things. So one thing is I'm talking about universal moral values and duties. And I identified some studies that showed some universals. And then I'm saying, do these stand? Are they stance independent? So that's the idea of, are they objective? So when I'm looking at, are they objective? I'm looking, do they stand regardless of what our opinions are about them? And that's the question of, do they exist? And it's a moral ontology sort of a question. And so, yes, they do exist. We have these things, life, liberty, justice. I can go and spell them out. We see them codified in governments, and they're objective. So this idea of valuing life is an objective moral value that stands regardless of what Phi's opinion is or what Stephen Seen's opinion is. So that's the deal. Oh, would you like to see? Okay, so let me get the slide that I had on that. Go back to that. Okay, so this is the slide that is discussing if we have the idea of universals, does that make them objective? And the answer is no. Okay, so I said if everyone in the world did not value life, or everyone in the world valued evil, that would not diminish the fact that we have this existence of objective moral values and duties to do what's right. So even if people's practices don't align, we still have the objective moral values and duties to do what's right. So objective morality means we have morals that are stance independent, while universals mean we can identify values and duties across all cultures. Okay, and again, it follows that there's a source of this that's also transcendent to cultures. And so it follows that this source would be a transcendent moral lawgiver who really cares about us doing the right thing. He's given us a conscience, and that's one of the ways that we've come to these moral understandings. So now I will come back to the chat. Actually, see where oh, there we go. Okay. Okay, so that's, so Brian Stevens doesn't think it exists. However, I did show that it did exist. There's a number of different studies that have indicated the presence of universals. And we also have a number of studies and a number of reasons to expect that these are objective. They stance independent of what people's opinions are. I say universal moral values exist regardless, but you quoted a study that showed that universal morals exist. Wait, I quoted, how would you determine that they exist without this study? Well, I would look at other studies. I look at a lot of studies. In fact, I cited some studies in the slides. You might have missed those. So let me go back. Here's one study. This was of major world religions, atheism, United Nations, and the humanism. So we looked at this. We found some universals. Here's some other studies that have identified some universals. And again, all the universals that you'll see when they look at these different studies of cultures tend to be positive. One study I don't see that I've listed here, and I should have, is a study by Shalom Schwartz. He has studied thousands of people across the globe in almost all countries, lots and lots of different countries. And he has found, actually, I'm not sure of exactly how many countries, I'll have to get that. So I'm not sure, let me go back and say, I'm not sure of how many countries Shalom Schwartz surveyed, but he found that the number one value is benevolence. And number two is universalism, virtually across all cultures. So benevolence is something that's valued across all cultures. So if we can say that we have these universals that are out there, the reason I'm pointing that out is because the combination of this universal idea that we have these values and the fact that the values stand regardless of our opinions draws us to a conclusion that we have a source or a moral lawgiver who values things like humanity, justice, temperance, charity, mutual aid, honesty, all those kind of things. So the fact that humans who were destined for survival and focused on things such as food and shelter have now come to this idea, where we value all of these other great things. And so we can say that we've got the universals and they're objective. So these are still going to stand even if we're not standing. Okay, so you can see here, I've got a very old study by Westmark as one example of universals back in 1906. All the people around 1906 there might be very few people left who were around at that time in 1906 right now, but these values still stand. So honesty, charity, mutual aid, and generosity. So that's just speaking to that. So let me come back here. So basically, Brian Stevens wants to hear someone ought to blank, and it is objectively true. Yes, someone ought to follow the golden rule, and that's objectively true. So Jungle Jargon says, yes, objective morality is to tell the only truth that only your maker can perfectly cover for you himself and remake us again from the inside out by the power of his true word as no one else can. So well said, Jungle Jargon, I agree. So, okay, so I think right now we're going to, I don't know if I should continue with this or not, but I see Brian Stevens says, if the Nazis are about to find your hidden Jews, you ought to lie to them. So that's one of the arguments looking at an epistemological foundation or epistemological question. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about whether or not these values and duties exist. So I'm looking at the moral ontology, not the epistemology, Brian. So your question is something that could be answered through epistemological reasons, but I'm just asking, we were just addressing the question originally posed in the debate of whether or not objective morality exists. So that's the question, and I think we have a very fair case to say objective morality exists. So objective morality, again, if we had to go back and define it, means it's a stance, independent, moral values and duties that exist even if we have different opinions about it. Okay, so that's objective moral values and duties. Any more questions? So I think, so Stevenstein says, Mouse forever, your confusing ideas, objective things can be overridden when other objective things conflict. That just means the exact objective definition is do X unless Y, Z. And a lot of this one of the things that Immanuel Kant did that I think was an issue, which was a bit of a problem, was he would try to look at these different values in a silo. So he would take truth independent of any other aspect. And I think that God wants us to take these things more in a basket. So for example, you would take truth, the objective value of truth compared with liberty, justice, all these kind of things. You collectively analyze those when we perform certain practices. Now, again, this doesn't say that objective moral truth or life or value, any of those kind of things do not exist, which is my big question here. It's looking at how people align themselves towards that kind of stuff. And that, again, is going back to epistemology. So do we have any other questions before I let this go? I hope I explained this correctly. I hope that you'll understand that we do have objective morality out there. So we've talked about it at a universal level. We've also talked about it at a, as objective. And so I think we made a lot of these statements. So I think what I'm going to do is go ahead and end this chat. So I want to say thank you so much, everyone, for coming. I hope you'll like and subscribe and choose to come again.